you go to Africa or Asia, you find so many examples of classical buildings. So in a way, classics have been a global phenomenon in different places of the world, not just a European example of colonialism, but people have engaged in several dialogues with all these buildings and traditions. I'm Carla Bocchetti. I work at the French Institute for Research in Africa at Nairobi. We just published at IFRA a book called Global History, East Africa and the Classical Traditions. And the idea is to explore the classical influence as a hybrid global product that have been traveling to many distant and peripheric places in Africa. Today we've been talking to Professor Vasunia at University College London and to Daniel Orrell at King College. So Professor Vasunia wrote an article on the ancient confusion between Ethiopia and India, and we came to ask him about it.
The article looks at the confusion, as you say, between Ethiopia and India, and it attempts to understand how this confusion is worked out, especially in British Orientalist writing in the 18th and 19th centuries. Jones is known for coming up with a theory of Indo-European languages, and you would have thought that he would be suspicious of suggesting there was contact between India and Africa, since the African languages were part of the Afro-Asiatic group of languages, not the Indo-European group of languages. But nonetheless, he suggests that there is extensive contact between Ethiopia and India, and he suggests that Ethiopians even lived in India at some ancient point. But people that come soon after William Jones, Francis Wilford is one example, take up this confusion between India and Ethiopia and push it much further. And Wilford suggests quite elaborate connections between Ethiopian and Indian thought, between the Mediterranean and Indian thought, between Greek mythology and Indian mythologies. We know now that, and in fact he himself learned later on as well, that he was the victim of an elaborate hoax pulled on him by a Brahmin priest. And this Brahmin priest was inventing Sanskrit verses and suggesting that they were ancient, but in fact these were verses that the priest was making up on the spot. And Wilford was only all too ready to believe these texts, and where he should have been suspicious, he took them to imply that there was this extensive contact between the Mediterranean world and the world of India.
Here we are at King College London to see Daniel Orrell, who is going to talk about his contribution on Mudimbe.
Oedipus is a figure that haunts Mudimbe's writings throughout his career. Oedipus was a very important figure for another post-colonial thinker, Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was a Martinican psychoanalyst, and he wrote very famously in the 1960s about the colonial Oedipal complex, how the colonial subject was put into an Oedipal relationship with their colonial master. The colonial subject both wanted to kill or do harm to their colonial master, get rid of their colonial master, revolt against their colonial master, but they also envied the place that the colonial master occupied. So there was this desirous but also patricidal relationship that the colonial subject had with their colonial master, in that they wanted to get rid of them but then replace them and take on their place. And Mudimbe's interest in the relationship between his classical colonial education and the education of Africans in the post-colony, after independence, is reflected in this Oedipal, complicated, messy Oedipal relationship. On the one hand, he saw his classical education as a gift, but on the other hand, it's a curse. So it was something that he wanted to escape from, but he was repeatedly drawn back to it again and again. So sometimes in some of his writings he's very critical of classical culture, of Greco-Roman antiquity, in that he is critical of the fact that modern colonial discourse from the 1500s onwards often used ancient stereotypes about Africans in their own writings in the colonial period. So sort of phobic stereotypes about Africans with more than one head that appears in Herodotus, for instance, appears regularly in explorers' writings in the 15 and 1600s. Africa as a barbaric space is a very common stereotype in 19th century colonial anthropology. So in some ways, for Mudimbi, classical antiquity was used as a very harmful instrument by colonial discourse, by colonial power. But in other ways, he was inspired by other receptions of classical antiquity. So he was very interested in Claude Lévi-Strauss's reading of the Oedipus myth. And he applies Lévi-Strauss's structuralism to his own readings of Central African mythology and Central African storytellings, especially stories about the Luba and the foundation of the Luba state. So Mudimbi has this very complicated, sort of Oedipal, anxious relationship with classical antiquity. In one sense, it's helped to do a lot of harm. On the other hand, classical antiquity and its receptions has helped him interpret Central African mythological systems. It's a very interesting relationship he has with classical antiquity, and this Fanonian Oedipal complex is part of Mudimbi's makeup.
We're just trying to work on classics in Nairobi from a different focus, just trying to revive the neoclassical buildings and the colonial influence, but into a new way of reading those stories in an inclusive way, creating a dialogue between two cultures, not only one imposing over the other or erasing the other, but just a dialogue in which both have something to say.